Well, good morning, everybody. It is a beautiful day in the neighborhood, and just so glad to have you joining us today. I don't know about for you, but this is our 1-year anniversary of being online, and it's hard to believe that it was a year ago today, or yesterday, actually. No, it is today, that Leah and I were flying home from Florida. We were recording message in Florida about the fact that we weren't going to have service for this coming Sunday in person, that it would be online. I remember that first night being up all hours of the night and all early hours of the morning, trying to figure out how on earth we were going to do this live thing. And here we are a year later, and just cannot believe that is where we are at. If you're here today, I do want to highlight for you, to commemorate that, one of the things that we decided to do is a special Zoom lobby. We've done these before, Zoom lobbies. We do them most weeks, and it's just a chance for a few folks to check in and connect with one another and say hi. This week, we're encouraging as many to come as possible. Just a chance for us to see some faces and connect. And I know it's likely going to be chaos. Zoom with a pile of people can be a bit chaotic, but what a good chance for us to just see each other, even for a short time. You can grab your dessert. We encourage you to do that. Bring a treat with you. That's what we'd be doing if we were in person, having some kind of cake or something. So grab your dessert. We're going to have some door prizes, which is going to be fun. I'm going to post some questions in the chat. And for our kids, we're going to have a bit of a coloring contest this week. Wanda sent out in the email this as the coloring sheet. Now, if you didn't get this, that's okay. You can color whatever you want if you've got a different one. But during the Zoom lobby, we're going to get you guys to show us your pictures and encourage you to do that. We're going to have a bit of a coloring contest for our kids. So encourage you guys, if you're following along in the service, that's great. Maybe you want to color while you're following along. Again, I have no doubt that it might be a little chaotic in there, but what a good chance to just see one another, even for just a few minutes. Well, if you have a Bible, today we're going to be carrying on in the book of Exodus, looking at chapter 7. So for those of you maybe don't know, that is the second book of the Bible. If you open the Bible up, there's the first, it's called book is Genesis and then Exodus. And you can follow that to Exodus chapter 7. That's where we're going to be spending our time this morning. If you have your questions, we always do some live Q&A, and so you can text those to 519-893-2951. You can also email or chat. You can email those questions or post them in the chat, and if you email them, then I will get to those this Tuesday night. It's after the message live. Now, you may not know this about me, but one of my favorite movies is Lord of the Rings. And I don't talk about it very often, so you may not have known that, but it's the truth. It's one of my favorite movies. And there's this scene that I love so much in the second movie, The Two Towers, and it's this scene where the battle is about to begin at Helm's Deep. And the enemy, Saruman's army, is standing out in front of Helm's Deep, and they're hitting their spears against the ground, and they're roaring, and all these things, and everybody else is up in the keep at Helm's Deep, ready to fight this battle. And all of a sudden, the rain comes, and then this guy releases an arrow, and it hits one of the characters, and that kind of precipitates the thing getting started. And so then the enemy starts to rush toward the gates, and the king of Rohan makes this great statement. He says, "And so it begins." And I feel like this is where we are at in our story today in the book of Exodus. Everything has been leading up to this point. Everything has been moving in this direction, from the calling of Moses and Moses fighting against God and not wanting to go, and all the stuff that went along with that, to the first confrontation with Pharaoh, the parley that really achieved no results. The conversations have been completed and there's been no resolution. And so now it's going to begin. Well, let's get into our text this morning. And we're going to split chapter 7 up into 3 sections and cover them all today. So chapter 7 is where we're going to begin today, starting in verse 1 and reading to verse 7. Then the Lord said to Moses, "See, I have made you like God to Pharaoh, and your brother Aaron will be your prophet. You are to say everything I command you, and your brother Aaron is to tell Pharaoh to let the Israelites go out of his country. But I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and though I multiply my miraculous signs and wonders in Egypt, he will not listen to you. Then I will lay my hand on Egypt, and with mighty acts of judgment I will bring out my divisions, my people the Israelites. And then the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord when I stretch out my hand against Egypt and bring the Israelites out of it." Moses and Aaron did just as the Lord commanded them. Moses was 80 years old, and Aaron was 83 when they spoke to Pharaoh. As we ended chapter 6 last week, Moses again had been told to go and say everything to Pharaoh. And it was a repetition of a couple verses. It's his bookends of the genealogy that comes at the end of chapter 6. And of course, Moses again says, "I can't go. I'm a man of uncircumcised lips." And so now God reiterates for Moses what is going to happen, what he's going to do with his strong hand, his mighty arm. And we talked about this last week, but this phrase, again, keeps coming up because it is a direct affront to the Egyptian people. This was a phrase that was used of Pharaoh and his deity, his godness in his powers. And so this idea of his mighty hand, his outstretched arm, God is actually now claiming that for himself. And what he's reiterating for Moses is that this battle is not between Egypt and Israel. And the battle is not between Moses and Pharaoh. It is between Yahweh and the gods of Egypt, including Pharaoh, who was viewed as a god. And so right off the bat, we have this verse, and it says, God says to Moses, "See, I have made you God to Pharaoh." Now, the NIV, which I read from just a few moments ago, actually adds a word in there. It adds, "I will make you like God to Pharaoh," but that's not actually in the original text. There is no like there. God just simply says, "I will make you God to Pharaoh." And it makes a lot of sense when you realize that Pharaoh was viewed as a deity. And so now it's them on equal playing fields, you know. And it's not that Moses is transforming into some kind of actual god. That's not what this is talking about here. But Moses will go before him, and he will speak on behalf of and perform miracles on behalf of Yahweh. The text then carries on, and God says that he will harden Pharaoh's heart. Again, we're not going to get into that this morning. We talked about that February 21st. If you kind of read that, we're like, wait a minute, what? God did what to his heart? And maybe you're kind of questioning how that plays in. I covered that in detail on February 21st. So I encourage you to go back and check that out. But essentially, we would suggest that Pharaoh here, in God hardening his heart, God is giving him over to where he's already at. Pharaoh is already a hardened man, enslaving a whole nation of people and treating them brutally. Pharaoh's heart is hard, and God is going to allow that to continue on. Now, God is going to perform signs and wonders this morning, and that's where we are going to get into shortly. But there's one other thing that I think is important to point out before we get there. And I think it's the question, who is this judgment against? Who are these plagues, the ones that we're getting ready to start digging into today? Who are they against? Or what are they designed for? Are they just random? I know for me, I read these plagues. I've read this story many times before. In fact, when I went to Africa, we had to run this obstacle course. And one of the things we had to do was go through these tires, like a football player, where the tires sit on the ground. You got to through the tires. And as you went through, you had to name off the plagues of Egypt. For me, they were just random acts, random crazy things of nature. But I think what we're going to see this morning, that these in fact are not random, but they have a purpose. God is going to do signs and wonders, and he is going to bring judgment, but who is that really against? And we have a bit of a foretaste of this, and I think God gives us the answer right in the text. He says, "I'll do these things so that the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord." These plagues are not just random, but it becomes clear that these are an attack on the deities of Egypt. As H.L. Ellison put it, for those who experienced them, the real victims of the plagues were Egypt's nature gods, who were increasingly shown to be powerless to protect their worshippers. Now, I'm not sure I fully agree with Ellison in his statement here. At the end of the day, these plagues brought devastation on the Egyptian people, from livestock dying to plants and crops dying to actual physical harm to hunger to economic struggle, including even eventually the firstborn son who will die as one of these plagues. But even though I don't fully agree, he does make a good point that these plagues are more than just random occurrences. They are an assault on the religion and gods of Egypt. They answer the question, who is God? God is about to do some things never before seen so that the Egyptians will know that he is God. I think it's ironic because if you remember back to Exodus chapter 5, verses 2, when Pharaoh is first confronted by Moses and Aaron say, thus says Yahweh, let my people go that they may come and worship me. And Pharaoh basically scoffs at them. I don't know this Yahweh. I won't listen to his commands. He uses the divine formula there, thus says. Doesn't matter at all to Pharaoh. He doesn't care. He doesn't know this Yahweh, and God is going to reveal himself as the God, as the great God through these plagues. God is going to reveal who is in control, who is in power, who is God. And what's amazing is some of the Egyptians actually come to believe and follow Yahweh. John Curd points this out. He says, God's intention in bringing the plagues on Egypt is primarily judgmental. However, in another sense, it is evangelistic. During the plagues, for example, some of the Egyptian people come to believe the words of God and subsequently acted upon them. In other words, they believed in God and they began to follow him. And so that's kind of the purpose behind some of these plagues. So Moses and Aaron, after this first little blur between God and Moses and Aaron, they go to Pharaoh. And I think it's important to note, it emphasizes that they went. They went as God commanded them. And this is really a turning point for them. They become very faithful to this calling. And up until the point where they cross the sea, there are no more uncertainties for Moses. He just follows what God calls him to do. He's faithful to the calling. And so we pick up the story there. Reading from verses 8 to 13. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, when Pharaoh says to you, perform a miracle, then say to Aaron, take your staff and throw it down before Pharaoh, and it will become a snake. So Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh, and they did just as the Lord commanded. Aaron threw his staff down in front of Pharaoh and his officials, and it became a snake. Pharaoh then summoned the wise men and sorcerers, and the Egyptian magicians also did the same things by their secret arts. Each one threw down his own staff, and it became a snake. But Aaron's staff swallowed up their staffs. Yet Pharaoh's heart became hard, and he would not listen to them, just as the Lord had said. Now, one of the first questions that comes up, and I'm going to go through a couple of things today, some things that if you were to Google these stories, you might find some things on the internet. So I just want to touch on them because I think it is important for us as we wrestle through these texts to not just kind of read it and move on, but if somebody else has read this and they've Googled it, they might have these same questions. So one of the first questions that comes up is, was this a snake or a crocodile? Some of this debate comes out of the wording. Some of it comes out of the place. Crocodile seems more likely at the Nile, where a snake seems more likely in the desert. And I can't get into all of that fully here. I'm going to touch on that after the message live. So if you want to hear a little bit more about some of the debate around whether this is a snake or a crocodile, you can tune in there. I'll deal with that quickly there. But I want to suggest this morning that we here today are dealing with a snake, not a crocodile. And I think it's because of the way that I see the plagues as a constant assault on the deities of Egypt. Snakes played a huge role in Egyptian thought. For example, one of the main goddesses named Wadjet was protective and representative of a deity of Lower Egypt, the Delta region, which is where our story takes place. Not only that, but she was a goddess who represented terror to the enemies, a symbol of his power. She was portrayed as an upreared cobra, that is a snake that is up and ready to attack. Now, if that sounds familiar to you and you're thinking about Egyptian history, it may be if you've ever had the opportunity to see something like this. Now, this is a sarcophagus of King Tut. And King Tut's sarcophagus here, I'm going to show you a closer up picture of this. This is the headpiece of that. Now, what do you see on the top of the head there? If you guessed that it was an upreared cobra, you would have been correct. Right on the top of the sarcophagus, on the head, was an upreared cobra. And the live pharaohs would have worn this too as part of their headdress. They would have worn a headdress that had an upreared cobra, symbolizing the god of Wadjet, who was meant to bring protection to Pharaoh, terror to the enemies. Wadjet, this snake, was a symbol of power. In fact, even commemorating a victory over the Hittites, Ramses II had an inscription that said, attributing some of his victory actually to Wadjet for beating back the enemies. And so here, in throwing down the staff and it becoming a snake right at the feet of Pharaoh, God is directly affronting, directly assaulting this first deity, the deity that sits right on Pharaoh's headdress. God is again taking a symbol of Egypt's power and demonstrating his power over it. And so then God, Pharaoh calls his magicians, which likely would have been priests, people who were the religious leaders. And they're called for, and they do the same kind of thing. Now, it's hard to know how they did it. There are two kind of main ways people think about this. One is that it's a trick or a bit of an illusion. So, for example, in Egypt, there are tales of an ancient art where by a group called the Bacilli, who were able to hypnotize snakes. They would put it in a state of catalepsy by pinching its neck in such a way that it would be stiff as a staff, and you could use it as a staff. And then when you would throw it down, it would become alive again. So maybe that's how they did it. Others would suggest, no, this just happened by some sort of evil supernatural power. Again, referenced by the secret arts. I'm not sure we'll ever know, and I'm not sure it matters. But what we do know is that Aaron's snake swallows theirs. And in this happening, he was destroying the authority and power that those rods symbolized, demonstrating power over the god Wadjet. And now we're going to get to our first full-on plague. After this snake battle, which is a sign where Yahweh demonstrates superiority to Wadjet, Pharaoh is still unmoved. He's still hard-hearted. And so we get to our first plague, verse 14. Then the Lord said to Moses, Pharaoh's heart is unyielding. He refuses to let the people go. Notice here, by the way, even though God has said he's going to harden Pharaoh's heart, at this point, we don't have that in the text yet, that God has hardened his heart. Each time it's Pharaoh hardening his own heart, or that his heart is hard already. Just want to point that out, because we will see later on that God hardens his heart, but that hasn't quite happened yet in the stuff that we've read. So he says, go out to Pharaoh in the morning as he goes out to the water. Wait on the bank of the Nile to meet him, and take in your hand the staff that was changed into a snake. Then say to him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has sent me to say to you, let my people go so that they may worship me in the desert. But until now you have not listened. This is what the Lord says, by this you will know I am the Lord. With the staff that is in my hand, I will strike the water of the Nile, and it will be changed to blood. The fish in the Nile will die. The river will stink. The Egyptians will not be able to drink its water. The Lord said to Moses, tell Aaron, take your staff and stretch your hand over the waters of Egypt, over the streams and canals, over the ponds and all the reservoirs. and they will turn to blood. Blood will be everywhere in Egypt, even in the wooden buckets and stone jars. Moses and Aaron did just as the Lord had commanded. He raised his staff in the presence of Pharaoh and his officials, and he struck the water of the Nile, and all the water was changed to blood. The fish in the Nile died. The river smelled so bad that the Egyptians could not drink its water. Blood was everywhere in Egypt, but the Egyptian magicians did the same thing by their secret arts. And Pharaoh's heart became hard. He would not listen to Moses and Aaron, just as the Lord had said. Instead, he turned and went to his palace, and he did not take even this to heart. And all the Egyptians dug along the Nile to get drinking water, because they could not drink the water of the river. Now, before we unpack this parable, this plague, just a little bit, I think I want to begin by just noting that there are a few different ways of understanding the plagues. And again, if you were to Google this and say, well, what happened with the plagues, or how we understand the plagues, what you're going to find, and even if you read commentaries, depending on which commentaries you read, you're going to see that there are really a few different ways of understanding the plagues. According to John Currid in his book, Ancient Egypt in the Old Testament, there typically are four basic approaches to how we understand the plagues. Now, I'm not going to go through all four. I want to tackle just the two most common this morning. The first is that the plagues were natural disasters. And this would be a majority view among most scholars, that the order of the plagues was naturally progressive, that one plague led to the next, and that these plagues were actually just natural disasters that happened. And they would cite that similar types of things happen today or have happened in history, and so that proves that these were just natural disasters. Flinders Petrie was one such scholar who posited this, and here's a quote from him that kind of describes this first plague the way he sees it. He says, "The river turned to blood with the fish dying, was the unwholesome, stagnant Nile just at the lowest before the inundation, when it is red and swarming with organisms. The Egyptians have to resort to wells and cisterns at this time in the early part of June." So he's suggesting that this takes place at a time, it's a natural occurrence, that basically it's already low, and that's why the water is red. And this would be held mostly by people who don't believe in supernatural power or divine causation. Now, there are some significant issues here. For example, he would go on to say that all the plagues from 1 to 6 are interconnected, that one leads to the next. And even if that was the case, it doesn't explain 7 to 9, because those miracles are not connected to the first 6. And if you go a step further, or those natural disasters, as they would term them, if you go a step further, plague number 10 certainly isn't connected to any of the others. In fact, Flinders Petrie almost just glosses over that one altogether. One of the commentaries I read, so did the author. He kind of said, yeah, these are probably natural disasters, except the last one. And that's about all he had to say about that. The second issue that I see with interpreting this way, and again, if you do, that's okay, but I do see some significant problems with this. The second part is that the narrative nowhere supports this idea that one plague precipitated the next. We just don't have that in the text. Also, to make this plausible, there's a lot of things that Flinders Petrie and those who have followed him infer. For example, the frogs have to carry anthrax, and the anthrax gets, spread by the lice to the animals, which kills the animals. There's a lot of things that they're adding to the text that we don't actually see there. And finally, I think if it's a natural disaster, it actually takes away from a huge amount of the force of this whole passage. If it's a natural disaster and something that happens every year, just starting with the plague of the blood, Pharaoh wouldn't even bother to call his magicians to make it happen. He would just simply say, Moses, this happens every year. Of course, the water is red. It's an inundate. Also, waving his staff over it. I mean, if it's a natural occurrence. And Moses grew up in Egypt. Let's not forget. Moses grew up 40 years in Egypt. He would have known about the inundation. The inundation was when the flood, when the waters of the Nile would rise and they flood over the banks. And that's what makes the land so fertile around the Nile. Moses would have known all that. So to do a plague, ooh, look, like Pharaoh would laugh him out of the court. And truthfully, I don't think Moses would would be looked at very highly in that case. Now, the other most common view, and this tends to be where I'm going to land, as you may have guessed, is the polemic view. This is the idea that the plagues were miracles that happened and that they were presented as miracles or things against the Egyptian deities. That the plagues are not random, but that every plague is an attack on Pharaoh first, as the deity who oversees it all, and over the various deities of Egypt. Now, we actually see this from some other texts. Let me just flip over to Exodus 12:12. And this is part of the description of the Passover and part of the description of the plague on the firstborn. But in 12:12, this is what we read. It says, "On that same night, I will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn, both men and animals, and I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord." Who's the judgment on here? It is a judgment on the gods of Egypt. If we flip over to Numbers chapter 33, again, this just gives credence to this idea that there's a polemic going on here. It is an attack on the gods of Egypt. Numbers 33, verse 4. I'll read verse 3. The Israelites set out from Ramses on the 15th day of the first month, the day after the Passover. This is recounting what happened. They marched out boldly in full view of the Egyptians, who were burying all their firstborn, whom the Lord had struck down among them. For the Lord brought judgment on their gods. Even the text itself supports this idea that these plagues were judgments on the gods of Egypt. Primarily, it was a judgment against Pharaoh as a starting point, because Pharaoh had the duty of maintaining divine ma'at. I've talked about this a little bit before, but ma'at was this idea of order. And Pharaoh was responsible for that, to make sure that the Nile and all other things, the crops, the sun, were all working well. And in these plagues, Yahweh is going to reverse Ma'at and reveal who truly is the master of Ma'at. There is no other God but Yahweh. Jim Hoffmeyer puts it like this. He says, the plagues of Exodus 7-10 would have been understood by Pharaoh and the Egyptians as a direct assault on the king, who was responsible for the proper function of the Nile, the crops, and the sun. This could be why the unnamed Pharaoh of the Exodus is so angered by the signs and wonders. They were beyond the limits of his control. Perhaps his continued obstinacy was due to his hoping he could somehow reestablish himself as Lord of Ma'at. That's from Jim Hoffmeyer, who's an Egyptologist. Well, that said, let's dig into our first plague. The Nile becomes blood. Again, you'll notice here the use of that divine formula we've talked about. Thus says Yahweh. Again, he's revealing now who's really in control. And you'll notice the NIV, in the NIV, God tells them to stretch their hands over the waters, the streams, canals, ponds, and reservoirs. And there's missing a word here. And the word that's missing is there. You'll see this reflected if your translation that you're using, your version of the Bible, is the ESV. It's their ponds, their reservoirs, their streams, and their canals. In other words, these plagues seem to be directed against the Egyptians and the Egyptian gods. The second thing to note is they've taken some liberty in the translation here, adding in wooden buckets or stone vessels. You might see that in there. Now, if you have a translation that has a little number or letter beside it, at the bottom, what you might read is that it says something to the effect of or idols. And several commentaries I read actually kind of posited that that's a better translation. The actual Hebrew says that the blood will be on the land of Egypt and on the wood things and stone things. And most often in Scripture, where we see wood things and stone things together, it refers to idols when it's a physical substance. Now, something that was interesting I learned about this week is that the Egyptians, the priests, washed the images of their gods in water every morning. And so these idols would have been washed in blood. Again, it's another example of mockery at the expense of the Egyptian deities. And this is, of course, exacerbated by the fact that the magicians do the same thing. And you might think, well, yeah, see, they can do the same thing. But remember, Pharaoh's job is to restore Ma'at, not make it worse. So great, his magicians make things worse. That doesn't actually prove that he has the authority over Yahweh. It actually, it hurts the thing. Instead of him making it better, his magicians are making it worse. They're making more blood. And the point is that he can't fix it. Ultimately, this is an attack on the gods of Egypt. Pharaoh is responsible for the flow of the Nile. The Nile was its own god, seen as a place of creation and the life force of all things. There was a god who was responsible for the inundation called Hapi. This is an attack on the foundational beliefs of the Egyptians. This is a public humiliation, as Michael Heiser says it. It is a public display not only of Pharaoh, again, perceived as deity incarnate, but also of Hapi's fecklessness. It's this idea in fecklessness. I kind of did a word search on this. The word bird. Word bird gives the word of the day. Feckless is the word of the day here. But he says feckless is ineffective, irresponsible, incompetent, and inept. And what Michael Heiser is saying is that in the Nile becoming blood and turning red and being undrinkable and having stuff die, it demonstrated the ineptitude and incompetence of the gods of Egypt. Well, let me see if we have any questions this morning, and if we do, then I will get into those. Question this morning: is there archaeological evidence that the plagues have been discovered? Okay, good question. There is no archaeological evidence that the plagues have been discovered. However, there are certain texts that have been uncovered that write about things very similar to this, times very similar to this. And they could actually be referring to this time period. We just don't actually know that for certain. The archaeological evidence for the actual plagues is slim, in the sense that, again, pinpointing even exactly what time period we're in isn't a perfect science, as we talked about way back at the beginning. But there are several texts that talk about some of these kinds of things happening that could be referenced to some of those things. Aaron posted a question in the chat. He said, I heard a theory that the huge Santorini volcanic eruption caused the plague, so natural but not normal. Again, that is possible, and some people would put that theory out, though most scholars wouldn't hold to that theory, at least not that I read. The predominant theory on the natural is that it's just a natural progression. Again, it still leaves the question of the 10th plague, that only firstborn sons and firstborn animals, as well, sons of animals and sons of humans, passed away, they were killed. There's no other evidence. There's nothing else in the text. It's that specific. And so even if you were to go that route, you still have an issue with understanding that 10th plague. It still doesn't, and again, anything I read, any commentary I read that took a more naturalistic view, none of them addressed the 10th plague, really. It just kind of like it happened, or whatever. Like they almost pretend it's not there because it's so vastly different than all the others, which are generally nature plagues. They're plagues against the nature gods of Egypt, which were the predominant deities of Egypt. All right, I see we have one other question. I'm not going to be able to get to that. I'll have to get to that Tuesday night. I'm sorry. I'm just going in order of the questions I have, and I'm out of time. So need to get to our takeaways this morning. Thank you for those questions, though, and look forward to looking at the other two questions in a moment as well, or on Tuesday night as well. But thanks for your great questions, guys. Appreciate those. I love them. Takeaway number one this morning. God is the God of the world. Throughout the Exodus story, one of the lines that we're going to see repeated over and over and over again is that then they will know that I am God. They will know that I am the Lord. And this story, so much of this Exodus story is designed to reveal that God is the God of the world. Even in our story today, right? He says he's going to bring all these plagues about why, so that then they will know, then the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord. And you could easily read that in the story and think, man, God is so angry. God is just out to destroy. God is petty. Oh, I'm going to show who is really God. But I think what we have to remember is that throughout this story, many of the Egyptians do come to believe in Yahweh. They do come to follow Yahweh, and even some go out with the Israelites in the end. They join the Israelites in serving Yahweh. Some in the end will turn to him and follow him, and will even go with the Israelites. And it's such a good reminder to us that God is the God of the world, and behind everything else is this ultimate desire that the world would know him. I think Paul in 1 Timothy 2 writes this so well. I'm going to flip there for just a moment. Paul writes it like this in 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 1-4. He says, I urge then, first of all, that requests, prayers, intercession, and thanksgiving be made for everyone, for kings, and all those in authority, that we may live peaceful and quiet lives in all godliness and holiness. This is good and pleases God our Savior, who wants all men to be saved, who wants all to come to a knowledge of the truth. It's such a good reminder for us today that as we read these stories of the plagues, the ultimate desire for God is that they would know he is God, that they would turn away from the ways that they're living and worshiping and follow him. God desires to reveal himself to all people, to all who will listen, to all who will pay attention. And his deepest desire is to reconcile the world with himself. Our second takeaway is that we have a role to play in that. Because like Moses, we too are image bearers of God. As God makes Moses God to Pharaoh, it struck me as I was working on this message this week that we have a similar call in our lives. Moses, of course, isn't actually transformed into some actual deity or an actual God, but rather he bears the image of God. He represents God to Pharaoh. And this call to Moses is the same one given to us as a follower of Jesus. It's not just believe and we're done, but we are called to be his ambassadors, to live our lives in such a way that others will see Jesus in us. This week, as we go, my challenge to you, or my encouragement to you, one of the things I want to invite you to do with me is to spend some time each day reading over and meditating on and thinking about Matthew 5:16. If you have a Bible, you can turn there with me now, and our translations might be different, but that's okay. But I want us to read this together. This verse is also in your notes, so if you click on the notes tab there, you can pull up the verse there, and that will help you as well. But Matthew 5:16, I think, lays out for us this so beautifully. This is Jesus speaking, and he says, in the same way, let your light shine before others so that they will see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven. Can we read that together? Would you read that with me? In the same way, let your light shine before others so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. One more time. In the same way, let your light shine before others so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven. We have a call to let our light shine so others will see God through us. And so again, I want to invite you to do two things with me this week. Number one, spend time reading and meditating on this verse. Learn this verse. Read it over and over and let its truth really sink in. And the second thing I want to encourage you to do is take a few minutes a day. I'm not talking an hour, just 5 minutes a day. Maybe even at the end of your day before bed, read the verse over again and prayerfully ask God to show you maybe how you did in letting your light shine before others, and maybe ways that you could do this even better in the following days. Asking God to show us areas of strength and areas of weakness. Finally, I want to close with an encouragement to you as you head out this week. And as I continue to watch Moses in these stories, I continue to be encouraged because it reminds me of 2 Corinthians, where Paul writes that God's power is made perfect in weakness. And I want to encourage you with that this morning, that as you go, God's power is made perfect in weakness. You don't have to have it all figured out. You don't have to have every answer. You don't have to know it all. Because God's power is made perfect in weakness. God's power is demonstrated in full force in our weakness. And that is such a relief to me today, because it means I don't have to have everything figured out. I don't have to be perfect. I don't have to have my whole life set and in order. God will manifest himself. His power is made perfect in weakness. Let me pray. Lord, we thank you for this time together this morning to learn from this wonderful book we've been going through, Exodus. God, thank you for the way you reveal that you are God, and thank you that, God, you are a powerful God. But at the core of all of that, long so deeply to reconcile your world to you. You want people to know you. You want people to follow you, to love you. And oh God, I pray that that will be the case. God, I pray that we as your ambassadors, we as your bearers of your image and your name would go into our lives, and that people would see our good deeds and then glorify you, that they would see you in us. Thank you, God, that we get to be part of your reconciliation plan for the world. Help us to do that well, recognizing it isn't in our power, in our charisma, in our strength, but it is in yours. For your power is made perfect in weakness. We love you, God, and we thank you for this time together. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, thanks for joining us this morning. Encourage you to join us in the Zoom lobby. If you look at the chat area, you'll find the link there. You can go to that link, click on it. It's also within the weekly email, so you can find it there. And it's going to be a good time to just see one another. It'll start in about 2 or 3 minutes. Have a good week, everyone. Hope to see you at the Zoom lobby.